Well, Shalom, King of Kings family. It's great to be with you again today. And we want to welcome all of our friends who are joining us from around the world. We're all online this week because of our ongoing quarantine. So whether you're joining us on King's Community Live or Facebook Live or YouTube, we're so glad that you're here with us this week. And thank you for spending your time together with us. Well, it's going to be an eventful week here this week in Israel as we recognize two separate national holidays that are going to be taking place right here in Israel. First, Yom HaZikaron, or Memorial Day, as we observe those that have fallen in war and victims of terror. That'll start tomorrow night. On Monday night, we'll go through Tuesday evening, and then we'll be followed directly afterwards by Yom HaAtzmaut, or Israel's Independence Day, which will begin on Tuesday night and go all the way through Wednesday as Israel celebrates their 72nd birthday. Happy birthday, Israel. We'll be mindful of both of those events as some are going to be mourning and some are going to be celebrating. We'll be praying into those events, and that's what's happening this week in Israel. If you were with us last week, you'll remember that Pastor Chad launched us as a community into a new series we're calling Boundaries. And we're going to be highlighting God's boundaries in our lives and how these boundaries are more about God's love for us than about limiting us or taking away freedoms from us. If you'll remember, Pastor Chad made this comment, this statement about God. He said, our God is a God of order, that he's a God of definition, and he leans towards limits and boundaries and leans away from vagueness and ambiguity. When we think about it, boundaries bring an order and a structure to our world. In the physical world, these boundaries are easy to see because they're a natural part of our everyday lives. We see these in like fences and signs and hedges, sidewalks and railings or enclosures. Each of these physical boundaries brings an order to our world, keeping us, in many cases, safe from harm, designed to bring structure and protection and guiding and guarding us away from hazards. A spiritual boundary in this spiritual world works exactly the same way. They're designed by our Creator to guard us, to protect us, to keep us from harm so that He can bless us, so that He can give us our best, and so that we can be at our very best. Because we're in a spiritual battle that surrounds our lives, and as God's people, we see that these spiritual boundaries also serve as a great defense or a fortification, a blockade, if you will, against the advances of the enemy into our lives, but also against God's kingdom. God uses boundaries then in our lives to both protect us and to defend us as the enemy fights against us. If you'll join me for just a few moments, we're going to go out and look at what this looks like in real life. Well, here we are at a former battleground monument. It's a defensive bunker. It's a great fortification located at the top of this incredibly strategic mountaintop that overlooks the roadway leading up to Jerusalem. This is a tunneled bunker. It's built down into the ground and surrounds this whole strategic mountaintop. It acts as a boundary to those that are behind it to protect them. But what it really does is it creates a strong defensive position for this entire area leading up to Jerusalem. This is a lot like the boundaries that God has designed in our lives. These boundaries are there for protecting and guarding us on the inside, but also allowing us through God's Spirit to have a greater control and influence over the vast inheritance that God has called us to possess. This kind of fortification in a very natural way doesn't just happen. It's true that the mountaintop is a natural barrier to the enemy attack, but the bunkers had to be intentionally built and routinely fortified to keep this boundary strong and imposing. If a boundary like this, even as strong as it is, wasn't routinely used and fortified and maintained and secured, this boundary could quickly become compromised because it's the enemy's main target. The defenses could too quickly deteriorate and crumble away. A good army puts great efforts and intentionality into building up and maintaining a strong physical boundary, because everything else that they do depends on this boundary being healthy and strong. Okay, let's head back in. Boundaries, whether they're physical or spiritual, they're always going to be a natural part of our lives. Just like the boundaries that human parents are going to create around their own children. Most parents are motivated by a deep love, a care, a concern to bless their children. So they put boundaries around them, not to limit them, not to keep anything from them, but to actually keep them safe, to put them in a place where they can nurture them, to give them, as parents, their very best, and then to allow their children to be their very best. There are age-appropriate boundaries. With small children, we'll see a gate or a fence at the top of a stairway to keep them from falling and tumbling down that stairway. With older children, then we'll see a fence around the yard as we let them go outside to play, to make sure that they don't go out into the street. Or we'll keep power tools out of their reach, or harmful household tools, sharp knives. We're going to keep those out of their reach and make sure that there's boundaries to keep them safe. When you have older teens then, which is the season of life that we're in as a family, there's different kinds of boundaries that we put around our children. We're making sure that there's boundaries around how much time they spend on the internet and how much time they spend playing video games. We might put boundaries around relationships and friendships. And then we take time to begin to help them process the world that they're getting ready to step into as an adult, and help them put boundaries around their lives. But imagine that parent that wouldn't do those things, that wouldn't set boundaries around their children as they're growing up. We would look at that kind of person as someone who's irresponsible, who's being derelict in their duty. More than that, we would question their love for their children. We would question the value that they've placed on their children. We've often heard stories from people who grew up in homes that didn't have boundaries, as we've done different parenting classes. These people describe a home where their parent didn't or couldn't put boundaries around them. They grow up in these homes and they describe this feeling of being abandoned, of being uncared for, of being unloved, of looking at their friends that have boundaries in their families and longing to be loved like that, to be valued like that. You see, our human nature loves this idea of open spaces, of unlimited, boundaryless life, of unlimited wishes, of unconstrained desires, like an open tab with unending whatever I want, whenever I want it. In fact, we see Hollywood's biggest sellers give us that exact same thing. No limits, physically or socially or morally, whatever I want, whenever I want it. It's a big seller. But think of a life without our normal daily boundaries. A life without boundaries in a very natural way is going to be chaotic. It's going to be confusing, and it's even going to be dangerous, leaving us completely vulnerable and exposed, unprotected. I remember thinking back on my teenage years, remembering a season of pushing against the boundaries that my parents had set up, pushing and pushing and pushing until finally that day came and my mom removed the boundary and she gave in, and I thought that I'd won the battle. But as I went on my way, I felt this lack of care. I felt this lack of restriction, which wasn't a good thing. It wasn't exciting. I felt exposed and vulnerable, and worse, I felt uncared for and unloved. When I don't know and I don't have boundaries, I don't know where my yard begins and where it ends, it creates great confusion and anxiety on the inside. I'm not sure what I'm responsible for. I'm not sure who I am and what I'm not responsible for. Said a different way, boundaries give me the freedom to live fully. When I don't know and I don't have boundaries, I'm not sure what's mine and what's not mine. So here's our key principle for tonight. You're going to want to get this down. Boundaries promote true freedom. I'm going to repeat that. Boundaries promote true freedom. They give me freedom to fully function in what God's given me to do and in what God's given me to be. This is what it looks like in the spiritual realm and in our relationship with God. Paul describes for us in Colossians 1, verse 13, his rescue of us out of the kingdom of darkness and into the kingdom of his Son. The Amplified Version describes it this way: the Father has delivered and drawn us to himself out of the control of the dominion of darkness, out of that darkness, and transferred us into the kingdom of the Son of his love. The New Living Testament says it this way: for he has rescued us from the kingdom of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his dear Son. In this scripture, we see two different and distinct kingdoms. One out over there, a distinct and different kingdom or different country where sin is sovereign. And into here, a new kingdom, a new country where grace is sovereign, where God's Son, Yeshua, reigns as king. And into a new life where we are led by God's Spirit, where he commands us to be holy as he's holy. As citizens in this new kingdom, God commands us to look like him. See, our God is holy, meaning he's set apart. He's different than. This communicates a boundary that which is over there is not that which is over here. But see, we come from this place that doesn't understand, that doesn't know what holy is. We don't know what it means to be set apart. I often think of the children of Israel as God brought them up out of slavery, out of bondage, where they didn't know God. They knew about God, but they didn't know God. They didn't know his standards. They weren't familiar with his ways. They didn't know him. So like a blank slate, all they knew up until that time was humanness, common, ordinary, earthly, fleshly humanness. And then God brought them up out into the desert, and he entered into a covenant relationship with them. And then he begins to introduce them to holy, to himself. He begins giving them instructions and directions and commandments, not to limit them in any way, rather to give them a freedom that they had never experienced before. He begins to communicate distinction and value on them as a people, making distinctions in the clothes they're wearing, and the food they're eating, and the kinds of days and of the week. So eat these kinds of food, but not those kinds. Eat this, or wear these kinds of clothes, but not those. Work on these days, but don't work on those days. Worship me this way, but don't worship me that way. God drew wonderful distinctions, setting himself and his kingdom and his people apart as holy, and inviting his people and all of mankind to join him in that grace-sovereign country, that grace-sovereign kingdom, the kingdom of his Son. You see, God's boundaries add value to our lives. They set us apart to be like him. They add structure and meaning, and at the same time, they promote freedom as they protect and they keep us safe. And they're not meant to take anything away from us. Rather, they're meant to give us God's very best so that we can be our very best and look like him. For example, when we think about the boundaries that God has placed around his gift of sex to mankind, it isn't to keep us from something that's good or something that we would enjoy. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's because this gift is so good and that he's given to us, and that we're so valuable, that there has to be boundaries that protect this powerful and intimate gift, keeping it special and unique and holy. See, those boundaries are there to keep it as a safe, intimate place of godly goodness, to keep it rich and powerful and meaningful and fulfilling. The many boundaries around sex then don't diminish it, as some would say. Rather, those boundaries actually communicate the value of that which is on the inside. Much like the walls and the security that would surround England's crown jewels, God's boundaries communicate his love for me and my value to him. So this leads us to this question as we deal with this idea of boundaries. How do we see God's rules, his instructions, his commands? How do I see his boundaries in my life? This is a time for us to reassess his boundaries. More importantly, how I view and interact with those boundaries. If I see them as prohibitive restrictions, I'm going to be constantly fighting against them, fighting against God. And on the other hand, if I take them for granted, I might not be maintaining them. I might not be building up these boundaries in my life. See, it's important for us to realize that just like the army bunkers that we just saw, our enemy is continually trying to whittle away those boundaries in our lives. His ultimate goal is to blur them and to eventually remove them where they're not even functioning anymore in our lives. This is his full-time job. This is all that he does, trying to remove those boundary lines in our lives. And can I just say this, especially in seasons like this one, when all of our lives have been experiencing dramatic changes all around the world, where our normal routines have been disrupted and we're walking through very difficult times where we're distracted and overwhelmed in this time of battle and confrontation. But just like that army that built that fortification at the hilltop on the way up to Jerusalem, we have to be intentional about our boundaries, intentional in placing them, intentional in building them up, and intentional in maintaining them. These don't happen naturally. We've got to be intentional, establishing them and building them up and taking care of them in our lives. We need then to watch ourselves, to guard these boundaries. For example, we need to guard our thought life. Are our thoughts selfish? Are our thoughts fearful all the time or worrying? Are they lustful? We need to watch then how we treat others. We need to keep watch over the words that are coming out of our mouths and the actions that we're doing throughout our days. In a very practical way, we need to watch our diets, the kinds of foods that we're eating or not eating. We need to watch our work hours and how long are we working in the week, and are we taking our Shabbat and resting? When we sleep and when we get up, and guarding God's good gifts inside of us. See, it's in these kinds of seasons that we're tempted to take down those boundaries or to loosen our hold on them, to let go of the disciplines that God has placed around our lives altogether. As we come to a close tonight, we want to ask ourselves these questions. How do I view God's boundaries in my life? Am I taking care to keep those areas as clear, God-designed boundaries? Or are they becoming confusing lines or blurry lines, or maybe no lines at all? Here's our closing thought tonight. God's deep fatherly love for us wouldn't let us stay one moment longer in that place of slavery and bondage and in death. And so in a dramatic, selfless act of love, he tore down that boundary wall that separated us from him, that wall that we had built up with our own sin. And then he brought us fully across that border, that boundary, into his kingdom where grace is sovereign, to be a part of his family, to be like him, to be holy and set apart, conferring on us great value and meaning, giving us wonderful instructions and commandments and directions so that we could be like him, so that we could be holy. And that is good, good news. God, we say thank you for your boundaries. Thank you for being a holy God and allowing us to be like you, to call us into that lifestyle of holiness by these boundaries that you placed around our lives. God, we thank you for your boundaries. And we ask that you'd give us now the grace and the strength, the courage to build up those fortifications, to build up those boundaries. And then we ask, God, that you would use them to strengthen us, to make us look more like you, and to tear down the kingdom of darkness. God, we pray that you would do all of these things in Yeshua's mighty name. Amen. Amen. Well, Lord, bless you. We love you. Thank you for joining us again tonight. We ask that God's blessing would be on you the rest of this week. Go in God's peace